Patronage and social story. As a precursor to current day, art investors and corporate sponsors, traditional forms of patronage play a vital role in understanding the nature of the art-sponsor relationship and the value associated with the arts over the years. While the action of patronage can be seen to have existed with the arts over the ages, from the start of the modern period to the present, it is the reason behind patronage that has varied along with the effects that the relationship between the artist and the patron has on the creation of art. In these chapters, I discuss the history of the patronage as this has evolved from the Renaissance to the present day in order to highlight how the benefits and consequences of such sponsorship of patronage can have a direct impact on the growth and establishment of the art world within the South African environment, and ultimately how this can affect the market in which such art holds value. The Renaissance, the 14th to 16th century, spanning truly 3 centuries, the Renaissance has a time of cultural change that profoundly affect intellectual life in Europe. It has a period of significant intellectual growth in all areas, particularly those of religion, politics, art, literature, and philosophy. The Renaissance brought about the revival of the classics and classical learning, driven by the emergence of humanism in the early 15th centuries. Perry Baker and Hollinger, 2003. Artistic advancements could be seen in the increased emphasis of the human form and the natural world through the discovery of linear perspective in painting and an aerial perspective in architecture. It was a period of significant artistic production, resulting in many of the works considered to be masterpieces today and dominated almost entirely by various forms of patronage. In the early ages of the Renaissance, approximately of the 14th and 15th centuries, coinciding with the end of the Middle Ages, patronage was generally dominated by the church, which controlled many areas of Italy at the time. Other cities were ruled by a monarchy or governed by an elite selection of wealthy merchants and bankers. But overall, the church, and more specifically Catholicism, prevailed. The early Renaissance was a period of artistic production that was ruled by the patrons. They were active consumers considered to be the creators of the paintings, sculpture, and architecture of the period, with the artist acting merely as a craftsman carrying out the instruction of the patron. Hollingworth, 1994. As craftsmen, artists were hired to supply their employment or patron with either a specific work or with a variety of different pieces over an extended period of time. A contract would have been drawn up stipulating the requirements set out by the patron, and work would then process as direct. And as a direct result of this, the cost of the artwork was determined according to the material and labor involved, and the artists were paid for their skill and as craftsmen. Not allowances were made for those who excelled in their work, as so the creative genius of the artist has no recognizable financial value. In these early ages of 15th century, art was generally limited to a specific subject matter, as determined by the patron, and very little creativity was given to the artist in terms of the content of or what they produced. Effectively, one of the artist's only avenues for expression was through the physical construction of the piece, the composition, and the medium, which ultimately became the focal point of the artwork. Greenberg, 1973. Some cases are more specific than others, whereby the patron will define quite clearly how the piece must look, that people or iconography to include, even the order in which these people must appear, pigment sizes and delivery dates. Gilbert, 1998. In other cases, the requirements were kept simple, giving the artist only a general title or a simple narrative, such as the Adoration of the Magi. Gilbert, 1998. In such cases, the artist was then allowed to create the piece according to his own concept. Two advisors may be consulted. It may be that such attentions were a leading reason for the exceptional quality of works that were created over the period. As the artists were not in command of the entire work, they were left to concentrate intently on those areas in which they did have control, focusing instead on new applications in perspective, experiments on light and production, and the constant attempts in perfection in the portrayal of the human form. More importantly, this was a period in Italy in which Catholic Church ruled absolutely, in which it is evident in the domination of religious subject matter. The Church, in fact, was the majority patron of the time and supported many artists through its endeavors to decorate and so enrich the visual accompaniments to their labors in the cathedrals, churches, and chapels of their faith. For them, art was a means for celebrating their faith and the history that had led them to this point. It was an instrument for inspiring all believers, giving imagery to the literal world on which they based their belief. They notably, as well as wealthy merchants, also used their power as patrons to create a positive perception of themselves in the public domain. Art was used as a means of adversity, and only those who were rich enough and powerful enough could compete. And by operating in the realm of the elite, artistic productions began to take off many of the characteristics that this entailed, essentially becoming the luxury products that one will recognize around the world today. Unfortunately, however, Christian teachings spurned money and power, and so the only ways to effectively display one's status was through contributions of a religious nature. Burial couples, altar pieces, and frescoed panels dedicated in the name of the patron, and commissions of religious symbolic works. Charitable giving, for one, was the only means recognized by church for justifying wealth, and so played a part in expiating sin. Art form commission, on the other hand, was arranged for a specific purpose and played a particular role in 15th century society. For the artists, removed from the effort of determining subject matter, it was about the portrayal of the world in the most realistic way possible. Giorgio Vasari, 1946, uses the artist Giotto to describe this new exploit of realistic representation. The hard lines by which every figure was bound, themselves eyes, the feet planted upright on their extremities, the sharp, formless hands, and the absence of shadow, and every other monstrosity of those Byzantine painters were done away with. The heads began to express vivacity and spirit. The prayers began to have natural folds. Human passions were in some sorts expressed in the faces. This was the direction in which the artist's efforts were directed, representation being only element over which they had control. For the patron, on the other hand, art was about personal fulfillment and public acknowledgement. It was about gaining exposure and flaunting health, wealth, and status. The art that they commissioned needed to show their supposed generosity, and at the same time be a lasting reflection of the impression that they made in their time. Suffice it to say that patronage in early Renaissance Italy was about the patron. They were effectively consumers who were looking to purchase a specific product to fulfill a certain function. The subject matter was carefully and meticulously specified to portray a religious infinity, and the work of art was considered to be nothing more than a product. This manner of thinking is not dissimilar to that of corporate entities today in their sponsorship of the arts. Through this, it to be discussed in more detail further on this research report. Much of the change that one can see in patronage today began in the 16th to 17th century Renaissance as a direct result of the social, economic, and religious changes that gradually occurred throughout the period. The Italian states were becoming too self-obsessed, involved in their own status and the propagation of their current way of life. They thus continued to seek out more wealth, more power, more privilege, more esteem. The growing domination of French and Spain dynasties outside of Italy, who in turn desired that the Italians already possessed, led to wars that altered the balance of the power. Over the above this, the church powers had become too great, and an increasingly educated middle class were coming to queer the excesses and unnecessary expenditures they constantly squandered. The Protestant Reformation then brought about a breakaway between church and state, expedited by growing popularity of the printing press, which allowed for the swift and vast dissemination of Protestant ideology. This was an ideology that spurned the excessive spending of the church and called for a more humble leadership. It was a way of thinking that took off more quickly than anyone, including the church, even anticipated for appealed to lesser classes, those outside of religious leaders, and the notably who worked for their money and who begrudgingly watched as more wealth was accumulated and spent by their spiritual and political guides. And out of the turmoil there emerges as a growing aristocracy of independently wealthy merchants, a class level that existed outside of the pre-existing notably and the church. Throughout the advancement of the Renaissance, the growing independent wealth of this merchant aristocracy began to take on a leading role in the patronage of the arts, and throughout the growing influence of humanism, commission began moving away from predominantly religious imagery to works that incorporate the mythological themes represented in the classics. Moreover, these patrons were able to begin commissioning works that were not purely for the benefits of their image and in the eyes of the church, but could display their own personal power and wealth. This was particularly evident in the rise of portraiture at the time in both sculpture and painting, as well as the palaces and villas commissioned by wealth merchants, bankers, and other private individuals. All personal idolatry created for the purposes of self-glorification, wealth, and status was constantly on display in the commission of self-portraits, in expensive costume and opulent settings, to the extravagant architecture and the beautification of residences, but this in itself was an insufficient means of publicly portraying one's rank and importance. So wealthy merchants also made generous contributions to the construction and beautifying of public enterprises such as churches, libraries, and hospitals. It was a means of improving public perception that would later be adopted by corporate sponsors. And a revival of classic forms of thinking brought about by the growing interest in antiquity and the rise of humanism, the artist emerges as an independent thinker, and his work became to be appreciated as much for its craftsmanship as for its aesthetic qualities. The artist as creator was revered, and his work heightened through reputation. According to Vasari, the artist needed to encompass all areas of intelligence of high comprehension, being well versed in painting, architecture, sculpture, poetry, and philosophy, all of which was then applied to his craft. Vasari believed that this was the age in which the artist as genius was born, and to became to him the absolute pinnacle of the high arts. Whilst Vasari's opinion may be overly enthusiastic, the point he is making is that the artist was coming into his own, becoming more like the artists that recognizable in society today, respected for his craft, abilities, and creativity. By adopting the classic ideology of the artist as creator, as genius, artists were no longer considered to be merely workmen and were given greater autonomy in their creations, too often still within the boundaries and specifications determined by the patron, who was